And it was at that point I kind of thought, wow, this guy really loves data, because he spent a lot of time, the whole summer, trying to pull data from papers, databases, and was able to use that and publish that as part of his master's thesis. Just after that, we had a research project with the University of Aberdeen, and we're advertising for PhD students. And so, because I was stalking Andy, I was able to get in touch with him and kind of suggest that he apply for the PhD. And so he did his PhD at the University of Aberdeen, jointly with Shell and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK, looking at miscampus-related land use change and management impacts on carbon cycling, and developed a lot of field work and measurements as part of that, but also got into biogeochemical modeling. And it was at that point where he moved on from his PhD and took up a postdoc at Colorado State University to kind of continue development of models and biogeochemical models, more for agricultural production systems. And secondary to that, as another postdoc with Colorado State and Francesca Petrufo and Keith Paustian to develop new biogeochemical models. And so Andy developed the MEMS 2.0 biogeochemical model, which is a more detailed version of the DASEP model that starts to factor in microbial communities. And so I kind of followed him all through this process. And in 2018, nature-based solutions and Shell finally gained some traction. And instead of being just me working on nature-based solutions in Shell, I was able to tap Andy and say, hey, Andy, I think there's going to be a job advertised. Would you like to apply for it? And so it's really been a great pleasure to have Andy back working more closely with me. He's a great person if you get a chance to talk to him, but he's also a really great scientist. And so his presentation today on nature-based solutions in Shell will hopefully give you some sneak peek previews of some of the work that he's been doing with our scenarios team that's going to be quite impactful. So with that, over to you, Andy.
Thank you. Hopefully my mic works and you can all hear me okay. Yeah, thank you. I feel like I've had multiple introductions getting to this point of this morning. So thank you everybody for the wonderful, very, very kind introductions. Yeah, as Christian mentioned, today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about nature-based solutions in Shell. But really, I wanted to first address the kind of the elephant in the room to a certain extent. Is the why me, you know, an employee of Shell, speaking to everybody here as a College of Agriculture and Prairie View University. It's maybe not necessarily directly obvious as to why we're really excited about this potential collaboration, this opportunity. So hopefully by the end of my presentation, it will be clear why I'm here and why we're really that excited about it. But really, ultimately, a lot of this does come from what Christian was saying in terms of, sorry, this. There we go. It is around about the idea behind the scenarios that I've been working with Shell in terms of where do we go and how those nature-based solutions and natural land management really factor into tackling climate change as a whole. And the reality is the fact that nature-based solutions is really quite a key component of everything we do in terms of the energy transition. It may not necessarily seem that way from first glance, but ultimately, this is kind of a figure that you're seeing on the screen is really comes down to the fact that we have a growing population. Yeah, we have a growing population around the world, but at the same time, everybody or a lot of people could really do with improving their standard of living. And so associated with that increased standard of living and the increased population, we're going to expect a significant growth in energy demand over the next 80 years or so, during this century at least. And so with that increase in energy demand, there is going to be an inevitable shift towards the renewable sources and towards the low carbon or low CO2 sources of energy. But the reality is we can't switch the entire global energy infrastructure overnight, and there will be some fossil emissions that's going to happen as we transition and go through this energy transition, which isn't necessarily a terrible thing from the energy sector, but it's not a great thing from climate change perspective. And I think we probably all agree on that. The energy of those emissions is going to really have a huge impact on millions, billions of people around the world as those impacts of climate change really come to a head, especially in the agricultural space where billions of people depend on that for their livelihood and their food and nutrition. And so the reality here is that the way that we respond to the challenge of climate change is really going to determine or impact how the temporal profile for CO2 emissions is going to evolve over the future, or over this century rather. And so what you're seeing on the screen here is the sort of historical CO2 emissions as you've seen from 1960 going forward, and you can see it steadily climbing up until relatively recently, where obviously the global pandemic has had a huge impact on those emissions. But the prediction is that we are bouncing back very quickly, and those energy demand has not gone away. Fossil is still the dominant source of that energy, and so there is a huge amount of energy emissions that are going to happen, or are projected to have happened this year and going to happen next year. And so as part of Shell's scenarios team and strategy, we try to project forward what would be realistic narratives or a few different opportunities around narratives for future scenarios of how the world is going to respond to climate change and the energy transition as a whole. And so what you're seeing on the screen here is three different scenarios here, which the Shell team call Island, Wave, and Sky 1.5. What each of those means, and what each of these CO2 profiles means, is a particular narrative which encompasses energy, encompasses demand for food, and basically encompasses everything that could be associated with greenhouse gas emissions in all different sectors. And so just to very briefly talk you through, I'm going to paraphrase because I want to get this right, that each of these scenarios have a specific narrative that we kind of came up with. So starting with the wave scenario, which is that blue line, ultimately this is saying that as a response to the global pandemic in 2020 and this year, the expectation is that companies, countries, societies prioritize wealth. And so what they do is they almost continue business as usual to start with, recognizing that climate change is a problem, but really prioritizing the fact that the economy needs to recover, and we're going to really prioritize that over a lot of other factors. And so the narrative around that whole entire scenario is there is a recognition that CO2 needs to be decreased, but there is going to be a sort of late recognition that we really need to go quickly. And so this you can see by the CO2 profile that it's fast decarbonization, but it's late decarbonization. And the reality is that that is going to have a detrimental impact on us, our ability as a global society to be able to meet the Paris ambitions, Paris Agreement ambitions of 1.5 degrees C, or limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. The island scenario is one that's more underpinned by a more nationalistic agenda around the countries, really prioritizing their own nationalistic hopes and dreams. They're going to pursue the decarbonized society and deployment of renewables, but without that globalized coordination, things are going to be slower. And so that is yes, we are decarbonizing from day one, but it's taking a lot longer to happen. So it's characterized by late and slow. And the Sky 1.5 scenario is really our aspirational scenario around if we want to achieve the Paris ambition of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C by 2100, we need to follow a very fast and rapid decarbonization right away. And that's not just the energy sector, that's everything. But the reality is the energy sector doesn't account for the large proportion of those emissions. And so while we're going to be really focusing on energy, there is a huge number of other factors which need to be brought into this analysis. And so just to plot those three different scenarios from a CO2 perspective or a greenhouse gas perspective onto what happens to this century's global temperature increase. you can see that both waves and islands are both above the 2 degrees C increase from pre-industrial times. And so that immediately negates their ability to be able to achieve either of the Paris Agreement ambition at 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees. And that huge difference may not necessarily seem big in terms of absolute difference from 1.5 to 2.25 or so, but that has a huge material impact on billions of people around the world. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the impacts of climate change on agricultural space and all of the impact between climate, water, food nexus. And really, we've got to do whatever we can to get as close to that 1.5 degrees C ambition. So the question is, if we need to get there, what can we do? And the warmer it gets, the worse the impact becomes. But we recognize that the fossil emissions are the dominant factor within that CO2 emissions. Here you can see the sources of CO2 emissions on the above the zero line, and then the sinks of CO2 below. And you can see the blue wedge at the bottom. It shows the growth in CO2 concentration in the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere. And you can see there's almost a direct parallel between that and the increase in fossil CO2 emissions above the zero line. That gray wedge is going to be a dominant thing that needs to be decarbonized for us to achieve those 1.5 degrees C ambitions. But a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking to you today in more detail is actually that yellow wedge. As you'll notice, it is obviously much smaller than the gray area, but it's still significant. It's still roughly 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And that is representing the net emissions associated with the agricultural, forestry, and other land use sector. And so that sector encompasses all the deforestation that's happening, all the agricultural fertilizer application and the N2O emissions that result from it. And that as a net emission is, as you can see, pretty much consistent over the last 160, 170 years. So this is a huge challenge that we've always been adding more and more CO2 to the atmosphere. And what can we do to tackle that? And that's where I think nature-based solutions is going to come in handy. And so that's really where I'm going to be focusing with the rest of this talk. Specifically, because I'll just talk you through a couple of those scenarios. This is that extension of that yellow wedge that I just showed you on the left-hand side, but then our projections of what happens to it for these different scenarios. As you will notice, we've had 160, 170 years of pretty much static 5 gigatons a year. And what we're saying is we have to get that down to zero very, very quickly within the next 10, 20 years or 15 years ideally. And then beyond that, take that from a net emission into a net removal. So we need to move towards net sequestration within these natural ecosystems. And this is where we can start to buy ourselves a little bit of a wiggle room around the net carbon budget associated with achieving a 1.5 degrees C ambition. The sort of latest expert opinion is that we have roughly 11 years left of using our existing climate system to maintain within the budget. So basically, to achieve a 1.5 degrees C target, we have roughly 400 gigatons of CO2 left available before we exceed that threshold. And at current levels, that basically means we've got 11 years left of current emissions before we exceed that threshold. And so what activities like nature-based solutions can do is that it can sequester additional CO2, which adds carbon back to that budget. And it allows us the sort of wiggle room to find the global coordination that's needed to decarbonize the entire global infrastructure around energy and fossil emissions. This is obviously, I'm coming to you as this Shell perspective, but all of these scenarios are a global perspective. This is not Shell, this is everybody, because Shell in that grey wedge is a pretty small component. There are 200 plus countries around the world who all need to play their part, and we all need to come to the table. And that's what I think the Conference of Parties in Glasgow this year, COP26, did. And I think there was a lot of enthusiasm, optimism that needs to be maintained as we move forward with these kind of decarbonization opportunities. So with that decarbonization associated with nature-based solutions, there is obviously the natural question, what is nature-based solutions? And so everything that was shown within that yellow wedge is all activities that is on screen here, plus many, many more. Basically, any kind of activity which protects, manages, or restores natural ecosystems to a point where the human impact is not having the detrimental impact that it does today. So we want to be shifting from a deforested area of the Amazon, obviously, back to a more native forestry system. But similarly, we know that we can manage a lot of the agricultural land, the grasslands, much, much better than we're currently doing. And that's not just on a climate change perspective of sequestering carbon, but of course, all the agronomic benefits and all the co-benefits associated with that, which produce huge amounts of societal good, as well as the ability to feed more people and produce food that is more nutritious for people and provide income for those local communities which depend on that natural resource, as well as natural disaster prevention. There's a huge number of co-benefits outside of the carbon space, but all of these activities, plus many more, factor into how we can sequester additional carbon, and we can use nature-based solutions to reduce the impact of the agriculture or forestry and the land use sector, reduce that yellow wedge to actually being a net sink instead of a net emitter of greenhouse gases. One thing I wanted to very briefly touch upon is how the nature-based solutions come in two major flavors. We have all these different activities from the different ecosystems, but the ultimate impact that they have in terms of climate mitigation is we have either the avoidance pathways, which would be those that avoid or reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with a baseline case. So this is taking that existing net emission of the yellow wedge that I showed before and turning it into a zero line, essentially. Taking what we're currently doing and stopping it. So the avoided deforestation is a classic example of this, where we have roughly 20 million hectares of forest every year, which is being deforested. And a lot of that goes into either is burnt so that you can actually use the land for agriculture, or we use the timber in non-sustainable ways, and ultimately that results in CO2 back to the atmosphere. And so taking an activity around avoiding deforestation and embedding into nature-based solutions is we avoid those emissions, but we can't sequester additional carbon if that forestry system is already at a steady state. If we've already got maintaining the biggest carbon stock of that forest, we're not going to draw down more CO2 from the atmosphere, but we can avoid it being cut down. The other broad flavor of the MBS pathway is the sequestration pathways. And so these are those that actually actively remove CO2 and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere directly against the basin case. So this is the classic example where a reforestation project may plot trees and additional CO2 into those tree biomass, in addition to what was going to be on that land already. Of course, you want to make sure that the land is suitable to be implemented under that activity. So reforestation isn't appropriate everywhere. In a very arid, dry climate, we're not going to suggest planting trees because that's going to really draw, even if the trees do survive, they're taking water from the local watershed, which maybe is required for maintaining grasslands or agriculture in the area. So there is a lot of nuance around this, but really these are the two big flavors. We've got those activities which reduce the yellow wedge down to zero, and then we've got the sequestration pathways which take that yellow wedge and take it below zero and add additional CO2 sequestration onto the baseline case. So what I've given you so far is kind of introductions to nature-based solutions and how it plays a role in the global energy infrastructure and tackling climate change as a whole. But it's not overly clear why Shell is involved in this. Why is an energy company getting involved in this? And the ultimate reason is because we recognize that gray wedge, which is, we have a core responsibility to play a role in bringing that gray wedge down to zero and reducing emissions associated with energy. we recognize that we can go as fast as we can around converting things to renewable and putting up solar farms and wind turbines everywhere. But while there is still an existing infrastructure around using fossil emissions, we need to do something about those emissions. So I don't know how many of you drove here, and I don't know how many of you drove with gas vehicles or diesel-powered vehicles, but if we suddenly said, okay, we're going to stop providing any petrol, that is a huge problem. And if everybody said that, we need to find that energy transition where we help everybody transition to electric vehicles, for example, in that case. But it's not an overnight switch. We need to get there. And part of that solution while we go through that energy transition is not to just ignore the emissions that we currently are doing. And we need to use the nature-based solutions or accelerate nature-based solutions. And one of the ways to do that is to use a financial mechanism around carbon crediting. And so ultimately, this figure kind of gives you a brief overview of it, but typically, typically we know that there are a number of different sectors and a number of different sources of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, which are hard to abate, or they're going to have a legacy approach to transitioning this out. We can't switch overnight. And so when those CO2 emissions are hard to abate, we need to provide our customers with an opportunity to be able to decarbonize that CO2 emission or that greenhouse gas emission. And that comes in the form of carbon crediting, where one carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent in avoidance or reduction and sequestration of CO2 emissions in a nature-based solution system. Similarly, it could be an engineered carbon capture and storage solution, a geological storage. But what I'm talking to you today about is the nature-based solutions angle of this. So carbon credits provide you with a financial mechanism to say, are you willing to pay a very small proportion extra on top of what you're doing around refueling your car, for example, and translate that into sequestration or avoidance credits somewhere else when you're helping to tackle the fact that the issue of climate change. Not saying that you should do this forever. You should still do the avoidance of emissions and reduction of emissions first. But where you are not in a position to avoid or switch to an EV car or to switch your home to an electric grid or 100% renewable power, you can do something about it rather than doing nothing. And this will at least help us tackle climate change in the meantime. And so these carbon credits are done through independently verified third-party registries and standards. This is all done by scientists well outside the shell realm. This is all in external markets, and it can be either in compliance markets or voluntary carbon markets. They have rigorous, scientifically robust standards around how you can generate these credits, and then they have independent third parties which go out and measure and monitor those carbon credits and the sequestration or avoidance activities to make sure that that one carbon credit you're being allocated is actually equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent in the real permanent storage kind of way. And so with this so far, what we've got is a relatively enthusiastic market around carbon crediting. And what you're seeing on screen here is a snapshot of the voluntary carbon market for carbon credits. At the top there, you've got sort of a banner around whether it's a nature-based solutions bucket or a non-nature-based solutions bucket. And you can see roughly about 50% so far in the last 20 years has been from nature-based solutions, mostly in the forestry space, and mostly in the avoided deforestation space. And then roughly half has come from the non-nature-based solutions perspective, which might be the incentivizing people to put up solar farms or wind power, where we transition away from a fossil source to a renewable, which would also potentially generate a carbon credit. But as you can see here, the total over the last 20 years is 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, or 1 billion credits, which, as I put on the bottom here as a footnote, is, for reference, annual global emissions are 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. So we're growing, as you can see on the film, right? But we're still a very, very long way from being able to make a material impact. That's 1 billion hectares, 1 billion credits over 20 years. And we're emitting 40 billion extra every single year. So this is not a solution to everything, but this is a way to tackle a slice of the pie. We do need to throw everything at this. There is no silver bullet which is going to solve climate change for us. Climate crediting and voluntary carbon markets, I feel, are one of those, or part of that solution. And while the external market is still relatively immature in terms of the number of credits and the number of projects out there, Shell does have a lot of history around this. Shell has an environmental products trading business, which has been trading in carbon credits since 2004. So we have 17 years of understanding how to use these carbon credits within a broader portfolio. And what I'm showing on the screen here is just the nature-based projects portfolio. So you can see that we do have global reach around all of these different projects. A few of them, there'll be a few extras since I pulled this figure, but you can find out about them all on the Shell website. There's a Shell nature-based solutions website that we can dive into some of these projects. But ultimately, you can see here that we've got lots of different types of activities. The conservation, the blue activities, blue dots on here are more on the avoidance emissions. So that type of flavor where we're avoiding deforestation or conserving ecosystems, like protecting grasslands from being converted to agriculture, for example. Those activities reduce that yellow wedge down to 0, and then the red and the yellow, which are shown on here, are more on the reforestation, afforestation side of things, where we have sustainable forest management or reforestation where historically it was logged or degraded land, and that can reduce that yellow wedge below 0. And they're both generating carbon credits, but they have a materially different impact on the way that we tackle climate change. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of there we go. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why Shell is involved and why NBS plays a role in tackling climate change. But realistically, as I mentioned before, we've got a relatively small portfolio of carbon credits on the market at the moment. While there's a lot of optimism, we don't necessarily have enough projects to generate the credits to meet the demand of the number of people who need to do something about their emissions, but are still waiting for the carbon credits. And so what's needed to implement nature-based solutions at scale is a core question. And the first aspect to that is the fact that we have these sort of gold standards around how we can implement nature-based solutions projects, whether that be through reforestation or avoided deforestation. But we always need to keep improving how we implement those projects, where we should implement those projects, and how we can measure to ensure that all of the carbon credits that are generated are of the highest quality possible, where everything on the screen here is basically saying that carbon credit that you are generating, you're allocating to an emission, say from somebody driving what we say carbon neutral, is permanent. That carbon credit needs to ensure that the tree stays alive, or the credit that you're generating is permanent, so at least 100 years, basically. And if not, it needs to be compensated in some way, not compensated necessarily financially, but compensated from a climate change balance perspective. We need to tackle climate change. It's not necessarily paying people the right way. We need to make sure that there's no leakage. So we're preventing deforestation in one section of the Amazon, which just means that logging company goes to a different section of the Amazon. That's not additional. That's not going to tackle climate change effectively. We need to effectively deal with leakage. We need to ensure that it is additional. So saying that I'm going to generate carbon credits from this plantation of forest, which I was already going to plant, and then saying, oh, I want some extra carbon credits on top. That's not additional. You were already going to be doing it. We need additional activities to make a material impact on climate change. Similarly, we need to really make sure that these activities that we're implementing to generate carbon credits have a materially beneficial impact on community and biodiversity. Because if we want these activities to be sustainable, and we want those carbon credits to be permanent, we need to make sure that we're engaging with those communities and we're providing material benefits to those communities from day one. They need to feel engaged and really connected to the project. Otherwise, as soon as you go away and you say, okay, you've implemented, that's great, they'll go back to doing what they were before because they were never really invested and they were just being told what to do. What you really want to do is engage with them and learn from them. And a lot of the time, as I'm sure many of you are aware, we as I know from personal experience, I don't know the right answers. I'm going to a farmer, I might say, oh, you should do cover crop, you should do this. And they say, oh, I tried this, it didn't work. And my crop yield went down. What about if you do this? And then I learn way more from the actual landowner and the community themselves because they know their farm, they know their system way better than we ever can as an individual and as a recommender in terms of here's a nature-based solutions project idea. No, that's not the ideal way we do it. It's to say to them, we want to sponsor a nature-based solutions project. What ideas do you have? Let's come to the table and really work together to work on this. And then the final part of it is somewhat, self-explanatory. You might think that, yeah, of course, that's obvious, but you need to ensure that the credits aren't being overestimated. 1 ton of CO2 equivalent needs to equal 1 credit. You can't say, here's a credit, and actually find out it's only half a ton of CO2. We need to ensure that there is a standard around this. And of course, within that, no credit estimation. Stuck in this. No credit estimation. We've got a whole load of different aspects of it. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that we want to be able to measure and monitor the greenhouse gas benefit over time. And so, you can't have a double counting of a credit. We need to make sure it's independently verified. There's going to have to be all these standards. And all of this can be wrapped under the idea of quality. And this is one of the first levers and the first barriers around if we want to scale nature-based solutions to be a real player and go to that blue line of Sky 1.5 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector to being negative 10 gigatons of CO2 a year as opposed to positive 5, we need to ensure that everything is up to scratch and all credits associated with it are robust. The second side of this, and the reason why we're so excited to work with people like yourselves, is the fact that there's a huge barrier around research and development. And we may have a reasonably good understanding about how forests can sequester carbon, what trees to plant where, how quickly they grow, that kind of information. It's fairly well understood, and there's a huge industry around forestry, which is obviously built around this. But when it comes to soils, that's where there's a huge gap in understanding. And I speak very candidly from a soil scientist. I don't really understand a lot of things that's going on below the ground. I've spent 10 years really studying this stuff and trying to represent the mechanisms of microbial assimilation of carbon and absorption onto mineral surfaces and soil particles. I've tried to represent that and really understand it at the lab scale and the field scale. It's still somewhat of a black box. And so there's a lot of research and developments needed around the fundamental understanding to understand what is the impact of doing a nature-based solutions activity on agricultural and grassland soils. And will that result in soil carbon sequestration, or will that result in no soil carbon sequestration, or actually an increase in decomposition? Soil priming is a big problem. And so part of what we are really going to be constrained around in terms of scaling nature-based solutions is how well do we understand these systems so that we can fit that level of understanding under the barrier, under the banner of quality, which I just showed you on the page. Because as I said before, we've got to make sure that it's measurable. We've got to make sure that we're able to ensure that it's permanent and it's going to stay there forever. Those kind of factors can only be done if we understand the system well. And then the other side of this is the fact that, as I just sort of alluded to, you have the fundamental understanding piece, but you've also got the actual measurement and monitoring technology piece. So this is something we've been working on for a long time, but I know a lot of people externally have been working on for a long time. But how can we realistically monitor the carbon stocks and the greenhouse gas emissions from all these different ecosystems around the world? And that might be satellite monitoring, drone use for remote sensing techniques. We might be trying to come up with novel ways of doing soil measurements with spectral approaches or neutron elastic scattering, and very fancy ways of looking at this. But really, we need novel technologies around measuring and monitoring the greenhouse gases so that we can ensure that any impact on climate change we're claiming is real. And alongside that, there's a whole digital architecture around modeling and data interfaces, where if we get all this data, we need to be able to know what to do with it. How can we use it to reliably forecast the impact of a nature-based solutions activity on greenhouse gas emissions, so that we can say, yeah, I'm happy investing in cover cropping in this particular area because I know that over the next 20 years, this much of carbon will be sequestered and this many credits will be generated. And that means that we can decarbonize X amount of gasoline at the petrol pump. So these are the key barriers around scaling nature-based solutions. But one of the reasons why I'm here in particular and excited to work with Prairie View is, as I just alluded to, we kind of have an idea around forestry, but there's a lot of big load of black boxes around agricultural MBS. Each farmer does have the best way of implementing a certain practice, and that farmer has a great way, and across the other side of the road, that farmer has a great way. They may not be the same. They may be completely different. Why are they different? There's a lot of the R&D that we're talking about to help maximize agricultural MBS and make the best recommendations around climate as well as agronomic productivity. Because ultimately that's a core component. As I said before, if it's not giving back to those communities in terms of producing agricultural benefits, it's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be permanent. So I know that the imagery is tiny, the text on the right here is too small. But this is really just showing that this is not a space where we're coming at this blind. This is not a space where we have zero understanding. It's not all black boxes, but there is a lot of novel technology and novel approaches towards breaking open some of those black boxes. And there's a pool now, some of that is on the left-hand side. This is from a paper published in Nature Food, I think last year, by Herrera et al. But really, you can see this categorizing a number of different technologies and R&D themes where we can help to understand these systems better. And then once you understand those systems better, implement the most robust and the highest quality nature-based solutions projects to basically generate carbon credits, but also just generate the co-benefits that I talked about before. All of those impacts on agronomic benefits, crop yields, yes, great, but also we're going to reduce the amount of water runoff or pollution. And there's so many different aspects of this where if we understand the systems better and we really have technology and research development around it, we can help a lot of different factors, not just climate change. And so I've just pulled this up on the screen as a highlight. I don't want to necessarily go over everything, but I think that there's a sort of an x-axis here where it shows you whether things are relatively well understood and whether the research has been initiated, all the way through to prototyping and sort of implementing maybe at lab scale. And so what we are trying to do with a sort of collaboration with Prairie View or others is to tap into many different aspects of this. So it's not just focusing on what can we do in terms of the next year and a half, what can we understand then, but it's also thinking 20 years down the line. What is going to be the novel way of measuring, monitoring, and implementing nature-based solutions activities in agriculture in the next 15 years or 20 years? There's no, sky's the limit, really. And so the last couple of slides I had was really around how I see Shell and Prairie View and many other research institutions around the world being able to create a sort of a research program or a research agenda which has material impact at global scale. And I think that is really where we don't want to just do things in the lab and just do things to understand. It's about translating that understanding into real climate mitigation on a really material scale. And so our ultimate ambition here is red, and it's a very loose ambition. We do have some KPIs and metrics around it that I'm happy to share once we've kind of got everything formally organized and we're ready to go. But really, this is an ambition around agricultural research and development to enable significant soil carbon sequestration, but also that agronomic benefit. So everything that I've talked about before, but really, as I say, taking it to a material scale. So how many farms can we impact? How many people around the world can we really not only help them tackle climate change and have a material impact on that, but also how can we help them improve their agricultural production system and produce a product which maybe brings in more value to them and improves their standard of living. So maybe they're less reliant on energy to improve their standard of living. And this is really just under two different sort of big banners, the sort of pathway improvements and process understanding. So how can we better improve the implementation of agricultural nature-based solutions projects, and how can we robustly measure and monitor the greenhouse gases that will be resulting from that. And so the last slide I've got here, for happy to take questions. I know we've only got 10 minutes or so, but happy to take questions and also meet with anybody, and feel free to email any questions. And I'm sure we can make my email available. I'm really keen to engage in discussion around this. But these are just a few bullet points. They're not necessarily a whole holistic list, but of ways in which we can collaborate with people like PriorityView, as well as many others around the world. But there's the obvious things around collaborations, actual research funding, whether that be directly from Shell to PriorityView in terms of, oh, we really got this exciting idea, and you've got that exciting facility, and let's come together as great, brilliant experts at one table and really see what we can do together. But also there's always the opportunity for grants and match funding, where you might already be currently writing grants or beyond a grant, where you need a technology supporter or industry supporter rather. And so these are all the different mechanisms around Shell's. If it fits within our agenda and we have a really good idea of this fits into what we're hoping to do in terms of agricultural nature-based solutions, for example. This is certainly something we'd be keen to explore further. Of course, we have our own lab facilities, but you all have your own lab facilities, and so coming together, maybe there's gap filling. It's like, oh, you don't have that machine, we have this machine, we don't have that machine. Let's come together and work together on that. So facilities itself, and opportunities to pilot technologies and commercially relevant MDS projects. I know from doing it personally, first-handed, writing grant proposals are always a lot easier if you can tie it to something where they have a material impact, or you have a commercial output or something like that. And so if you can say, yeah, we're going to deploy this as technology in a commercially relevant project, which is registered under this standard, and it's generating carbon credits, which tangibly do this, that's a great value add that we would love to collaborate with, because we get some data around the novel technologies, and that really helps us constrain how we would implement nature-based solutions projects further in the future. And then the last few here are obviously, we're always desperate for a great expert minds in this world, and the talent pool that is in PriorityView is a huge one that's right next to one of our technology hubs. We're less than 45-minute drive from you all, and there's always a desire to hire the best and brightest minds in the world. So these are opportunities around actual employment and internships and collaboration, secondments, and we really want this to be an opportunity to collaborate both in terms of intellectual knowledge as well as the actual assets and greenhouses and fields and lab facilities that we all have. So that's where I had gone to. Hopefully, at this point, people are going, okay, now I understand why a guy from Shell is talking to us about agricultural nature-based solutions and how this all connects to PriorityView. But of course, this is the very beginning of what I hope to be a very long and fruitful collaboration. And so this should hopefully set the scene, but really what I will do going forward is dive into the deep weeds with each and everyone that wants to do so, as long as it's relevant to this kind of topic and theme. yeah, like novel ideas are never a bad thing. So let's get heads together, and I'm very excited to take this forward. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andy, for this nice presentation. And we open the floor right now for any questions or comments. So please feel free to engage our speaker. So yes, please.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Really impressive. But one thing I want to ask is on the last part is the internship program for the students. But which kind of specific knowledge is necessary for the student in our country?
I'm gonna leave this up to the experts who have gone through this process many times. I can take a stab.
So, great question. Great. Oops. I can talk really loud. Can you hear me okay? So we have a summer internship program every summer that is open to anybody who is a year or more from graduation, whether that be an undergraduate degree or a graduate degree. And there are internships in a variety of different technical disciplines. So, for example, my PhD is in molecular and cellular biology, but I've moved through a variety of different areas. So basically, anybody coming from Prairie View with a technical degree, something we would really look into. We also have opportunities in business and finance and other business-related areas. So lots of opportunity, and that all can be found on our Shell website. If you just Google Shell internships, you'll hear all about it.
Thank you, Ali. Next question, please.
The question is why biofuels are not included in the nation.
Why Shell? Sorry.
Why biofuels?
Why biofuels? So this is more of an adjacent side of things. So biofuels is another area that Shell is involved in, and part of the same GMship that Ali mentioned. And so this is really an adjacent field to nature-based solutions, not necessarily overlapping, but always they both need land, right? And they both need feedstocks, or they both need to work out why we should use certain land for biofuels or certain land for restoring natural ecosystems. And so there's a bit of a synergy, but also an opportunity to collaborate and say, this is best for here and this is best for there. Because ultimately, as I said before, there's no ultimate silver bullet solution. We need nature-based solutions, but we also need biofuels and many other things to help tackle climate change.
And if I could add to that, if there is interest in biofuels, we have a biofuels team that is also part of the organization. Maybe next year, if you'd like us to come and give a seminar on biofuels and what else we would be very happy to do that.
Sure.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. It's quite clear and evident that your collaboration will link with the plant side of agriculture. Are you planning to do anything with the animal side?
Yes. So the scope of nature-based solutions and our interest in nature-based solutions is basically any managed agricultural grasslands. So really, grazing lands are obviously a huge opportunity to move from maybe a conventional branching system to an adaptive multi-paddock branching system, or a more sustainable grazing system. When it comes to the enteric fermentation side of things, the breeding or the feed additives to reduce methane emissions from ruminants, for example, this is certainly within scope as a whole, but really what we are wanting to focus on is the sequestration capabilities and soil carbon sequestration in particular. So grazing lands where we can manage the herd to sequester carbon better through vegetation management, typically, that's great, certainly very much within scope when it comes to avoiding methane emissions from cows through creating an additive that they eat. That's not necessarily directly within scope of what we're really focused on, but nature-based solutions certainly is, and we as a whole, as a company, certainly don't rule that out. That is a big part of it. It's just maybe not direct focus of this sort of collaboration with Prairie.
I think this is a great point because it also talks about another opportunity that we're having a discussion right now last week with the visit of the Minister of Environment from Denmark, which basically also the integrated agriculture, basically, when the animal, the plant, everybody is on a circular economy, as they say. So the waste of one product is input for another. So we don't look at the animal waste as a waste, rather than as a fertilizer for the plants, and the plants is a source of food for the animal and so on. So that way you would have a circular or integrated agriculture where where everything fits into like a puzzle. So great. I mean, I think it's what mentioned also about the water quality. We have another question there. So what the water quality impact of next phase? So it's not only energy, but also improving water, improving soil, etc. So we have a question here.
Well, just a statement. My name is Laura Jones, workforce specialist. We are in an apprenticeship program with the Department of Labor. We would love to explore what apprenticeship would look like with Shell in our vocational programs also.
Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Certainly keen to explore that.
We have a question from Dr. Javad Baruri, who is a microbiologist. Back to you.
Good morning. So great presentation. Maybe a talk or a question for you. So we know that Shell is a big contributor but I didn't know that you are doing this in this. That's great. So it's not more like McDonald's, which is increasing obesity in this country and around the world. But also they are doing this small, healthy food, state program. So it's still hard to believe that what has this for Shell, because if we are doing all these good things like 100, then Shell doesn't exist because you have fuel or you have all this new technology. There is no team for you to have income, get money for that. So it's kind of still hard to believe that you are doing this. So can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the immediate challenge for always why Shell? I mean, how to believe this? And I think the key component to that is the fact that this nature-based solutions is the last pillar of what we consider the hierarchy around things. And so the priority really is avoid absolutely everything that we possibly can as quickly as possible, reduce as much as we possibly can as quickly as possible, and then only then offer the opportunity to offset something. So we are not using any MBS towards our scope 1 or scope 2 emission reductions. So we are not trying to offset our own emissions associated with it, but it's providing our customers with a way to be able to decarbonize something. So in an ideal world, we don't want to rely on an offset of gasoline, for example, but it is there as a way for us to continue with the energy transition. Of course, I totally take your point that, I mean, why Shell, and how to believe it, but we are really trying to make a material impact on this. And nature-based solutions is not designed to make a profit. It's not in essence designed to lose money as well, but it's not designed to be a sort of cash engine of Shell. This is a way for us to be able to help our customers decarbonize through our products. So this is really just focused on our scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions of our customers from the products that they buy from us. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything.
So I can add as well, and if you go to the Shell website, you'll see that we've launched a new strategy called Power in Progress. We have just gone through a revolutionary change over the past year. Many job changes, and we fundamentally changed the strategy of the company, really focused on how we get to net zero emissions. So what you may have seen in the media is we've divested in the Permian. So we've really stopped doing some of the work that is seen to be environmentally unfriendly, and we're investing that money in integrated solutions and other environmentally friendly options. So for example, we've also just introduced a more than $1 billion financial investment in biofuels in Europe. And I think if you watch the media, we'll see that we're investing more and more. And you may ask, well, why are you doing that? And the reason that we're doing that is because that is what we need to do as a society. We cannot continue in the way that we've been continuing for so many years. We have to make changes. And so it's really exciting to be a part of the technology involved in that. And I'm also really excited to include everyone in this room in that journey, because the technology that's going to enable us to achieve net zero carbon, it's really, really challenging, and we need good minds to make it happen.
Yeah. I think it's a fair question as well, and I think it's healthy and expected to have a degree of cynicism around it. One example I'll give you is, before I say that, we're very customer solution oriented. So when we hear from our customers that they want cleaner fuel, as a company, then we need to respond to that. I always use the example of Kodak. There was, a time when Kodak was the leader. You could argue that they did not listen or look forward enough to see the trends too around digital and things like that. So from just a business case perspective, everything that has been said in terms of our ambitions and our goals and our progress is true. But from a business case perspective, so that we are still here, we very much want to be a part of a solution to the energy transition.
Thank you. That's a very good point, because I think the question is great, and also the response. Also, because we cannot ignore the market. I mean, we like it or we don't like it. We're moving to cleaner energy. So you don't want to be another Kodak, as she mentioned. You would like to be another Google or another Tesla or other alternative. So Dr. Carson, you can ask a question, please. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I enjoyed the presentation. A couple of questions here. Looking at the opportunities, and especially that last bullet point of internship program for students, that typically lasts, 8 to 12 weeks, right? Are you guys interested in a co-op experience with students as well, or that lasts longer? Another question is, have you thought about sabbaticals for faculty members and for research scientists?
Yeah.
And third question.
We'll have another session for you.
All right. Where do you see nanotechnology in this kind of collaboration?
Yeah, okay. So the first question may be a little easier than the last to answer. So yeah, we certainly do have longer internship programs. We have done this in the past where we collaborate with individual institutions. In the past, in our team, we've had 4-year-long interns, which were sort of doing it as part of their undergrad as sort of a year in industry. There are many other different ways that we can scale it, format that. I think there's a lot of different examples within Shell where we have longer than 8 to 12 week internship programs. And in terms of sabbaticals or secondments, that's certainly within the scope as well. I mean, I don't know the details of how the back end works, but I know it can work. So I can, if I'm speaking out to please let me know. And then, yeah, where does nanotechnology sit on this? That's a tricky one to answer. I think that it's just one of the very, very many opportunities for us to collaborate. And so really what we are trying to do at the moment is throw the net really, really wide and basically not throw anything out and say, is this, I mean, I speak for Christian and myself, we have no deep expertise in nanotechnology to help enable this. But if there is an expert who we can speak to find out if there is a synergy or an overlap here, and it can actually provide a solution, that's where we are. That's why we're here. That's why we want to be speaking to the experts and start exploring that in detail. So can't necessarily say exactly where I think it fits, but I'm sure it has a role to play, and there will be an expert who we can speak to. Maybe you're the expert, I don't know. So.
Thank you. I think we have, we like the discussion, although it passed beyond the time of the seminar, but I have a last question here for Dr.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for the very interesting presentation. It was interesting that you had nature-based solutions. And I didn't hear anything about the worldwide trend, particularly in the United States, about use of energy substitutes like wind, wind production, and solar energy. And by the next decade, over 80% of vehicles on the roads will be battery generated energy. So that will considerably reduce the amount of exhaust that will help the pollution in the atmosphere as well as the temperature in the environment. So, and I know that that is in a conflict of interest with consumption of gas.
Yeah.
So there's a conflict of interest, but you, because of the approach that you have taken of nature-based solutions, you didn't talk about that. Do you think that is that significant or it's not?
Yeah, it's very, very, very significant. And that's the underpinnings of Shell's energy transition, shifting towards the renewable energy sources. And what I'm speaking on with my area of expertise, and while we're excited, why we're excited to collaborate with Perigee, if you have deep expertise in the renewable energy technologies, then we have a lot of business areas that will be keen to talk to you for sure. Why I'm here talking to you as a College of Agriculture is really just focusing on nature-based solutions. But yes, of course, that is the primary focus of Shell.
Well, I think this is a beginning of hopefully a long-lasting relationship between Perigee and Shell. And I think it opens opportunity in different areas, as it was presented in the presentation. We are looking forward for such a relationship. I'd like you to invite you to engage our colleagues, maybe our visitors, if they can raise their hands so they can see them here. We have quite a few of our colleagues who visited us from Shell. We thank you for coming. I think at the end, I'd like to thank you all for coming, engaging our presenters and our colleagues. More importantly, we're looking for your engagement for engaging our colleagues in research and basically establishing a strong relationship for the coming future. With that, thank you very much and have a great day. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, we deleted the.
No, yeah, I sometimes do sometimes one. So I was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Andy. Good to listen. Thank you.
yeah. How are you? Yeah, oh, okay. But yeah, no, it's good. It's good to see you again. Excited.